I have hauled dead cattle out of frozen creeks with my bare hands. I have set a broken fence in a hailstorm and not felt the ice cut me. Folks in Caldwell County looked at me, 6'7", 310 pounds, hands like dinner plates, and decided long ago what kind of man I was. Slow, dangerous, best left alone at the far end of the diner counter. They were not entirely wrong about the alone part. But none of them, not the sheriff, not the preacher, not the women who crossed the street when my shadow fell over them, none of them ever guessed that the thing that would finally break me open wasn't a bull or a blizzard or a bank letter. It was a 7-year-old girl in a yellow dress, standing at my gate at 5 in the morning, holding a paper bag and shaking so hard I could hear her teeth. And what she whispered to me, once she stopped being afraid of my size, that one sentence, it didn't just change my life. It made this whole town look at itself in a mirror it had been avoiding for years. This is what happened, all of it. I've never told it straight through before. I'm only telling it now because she asked me to, and I have never once been able to tell that child no. The dog started it. Old Bruno never barked at dawn. He was a coward of a dog, which I say with love, a stray I'd pulled out of a drainage culvert 4 winters back, half-starved and 3-legged, feeling sorry for himself. And in all that time he'd learned that the world out past my porch was not his business. So when he set up that high, anxious yapping at the front gate before the sun had even cleared the Henley Ridge, I knew it wasn't a coyote. Coyotes made him hide under the truck. This made him stand his ground and look back at me, like he wanted me to handle it. I came out in my undershirt with the coffee still cooking, and I saw her. She was standing just outside the cattle gate, both small hands wrapped around the top rail like she was holding herself up. Yellow dress, the kind with little white flowers, except it wasn't a summer dress and it was October and her arms were bare and blue at the wrist. No coat, one sock, a paper grocery sack clutched against her chest like it held something alive. I stopped about 20 feet off because I have spent my whole life learning that I have to stop 20 feet off. People are afraid of me, children especially. I learned a long time ago to make myself smaller, to talk soft, to keep my hands where folks can see them. So I crouched down, and even crouched I was probably taller than she was standing, and I said the only thing I could think of. "You're letting all the warmth out of my house, standing there." She didn't laugh, but she didn't run either, and at the time I counted that as a victory. "Are you Mr. Eli?" she said. Her voice was small and careful, the way a voice gets when a person has practiced saying a thing. "Most folks just call me Big Eli," I said. "But Eli's fine. Eli's my name. My mama said if anything bad ever happened, I should go to the ranch with the blue mailbox and find the big man, and that he was safe." She swallowed. "Are you the big man?" I have been called a lot of things in this town. Safe was not on the list. I felt something move in my chest that I didn't have a word for yet. "Who's your mama, sweetheart?" "Dana," she said. "Dana Whitfield, from the laundromat." And that was when the ground shifted under me, because Dana Whitfield had been dead 11 days. Let me back up, because you can't understand the girl without understanding the town, and you can't understand the town without understanding what kind of man I'd settled into being. My name is Eli Boyd. I'm 46. I've run the Boyd place, 400 acres of marginal cattle ground on the dry north end of the county, since my father drank himself into the family plot when I was 19. I never married. There was a woman once, Carol, who I think might have loved me, but I was so braced against her leaving that I left first, which is the kind of stupid that takes a man 20 years to understand. I am big in a way that frightens people, and I made my peace with that by becoming small in every other way. I didn't go to the church socials. I didn't run for the cattlemen's board even when I had the best herd numbers 3 years running. I paid for my feed in cash. I tipped at the diner more than I should, and I went home. That was my whole life. A man can build a fortress out of leaving people alone and call it kindness, when really it's just fear with good manners. Dana Whitfield, I knew the way you know everybody in a town of 2,000. She ran the wash and fold on Catron Street. Thin woman, tired around the eyes, polite in that pressed-down way of someone who's been disappointed enough times to stop expecting better. She had a husband, Garrett Whitfield, who I knew less well and liked less than that. Garrett was a charmer at the feed store and a different animal in his own truck, the kind of man whose laugh always came 1/2 second too late, like he'd had to remember he was supposed to. There were rumors. There are always rumors. I didn't pay them any mind because I'd spent my life being on the wrong end of rumors and figured I owed everyone the same benefit of the doubt I never got. That was my mistake. One of them, I'll get to the others. Dana had died 11 days before that morning at my gate. The story in town was that she'd lost control of her car on the Henley grade in the rain and gone off into the gully. Closed casket. The sheriff, Ward Prout, said it was a tragedy and an accident in the same breath, the way you'd say bless you after a sneeze, automatic and meaning nothing. Garrett wore black to the service and people brought him casseroles. Nobody, in all those 11 days, had said one single word about the little girl. I should have noticed that. I tell myself now that a better man would have noticed that. But I was a man who trained himself not to notice things, because noticing leads to involvement and involvement leads to people seeing you, and I had built my whole life around not being seen. The girl at my gate was about to dismantle all of that. Her name was Posey. Posey Whitfield, 7 years old, missing one front tooth, holding a grocery bag in the cold. I made a decision in about 4 seconds that I'd been incapable of making in 27 years. I stood up, slow so I wouldn't scare her, and I opened the gate. "Posey," I said, "I'm gonna make you some eggs. You like eggs. And then you and me are gonna figure out the rest. But the first thing is eggs and a blanket and that chair right there by the stove. That all right with you?" She looked at me for a long, long moment. Then she nodded once, the way a person nods when they've decided to trust someone, and it costs them everything they've got. She came inside. Bruno, the coward, immediately put his graying head in her lap, and she stroked his ears like she'd known him her whole life, and I turned to the stove so she wouldn't see my face, because there was something happening to it that hadn't happened in a very long time. While the eggs cooked, I learned 3 things in pieces, the way you learn things from a frightened child, sideways, out of order, with long silences in between. The first thing, the paper bag held a stuffed rabbit with one ear chewed off, a toothbrush, and a photograph of her mother. That was everything she'd brought. That was, as far as I could tell, everything she decided was worth carrying out of her own house in the dark. The second thing, she had walked. From the Whitfield place out on Route 9 all the way to my gate, 3.5 miles in the dark, in one sock and no coat, a 7-year-old. The third thing she didn't tell me with words. She told me when I set the plate down a little too hard and the fork rattled. She flinched, not a small flinch, but a whole body thing, her arms coming up, her chin dropping, her eyes squeezing shut, and she said, fast and automatic, in a voice that wasn't hers, I'm sorry, I'll be good." I have replayed that moment 10,000 times. I will replay it until I die. Because I knew that flinch. I'd worn that flinch myself 40 years ago in my father's house, before I got big enough that the flinch wasn't necessary anymore. There are some things you recognize in another person the way you recognize your own handwriting. I crouched down by her chair, slow, both hands open on my knees. "Posey," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I meant. "Nobody in this house is ever going to hurt you. Not me, not anybody. You're not gonna be in trouble for anything. Not for the fork, not for being here, not for nothing. You hear me?" She opened her eyes. And then she told me the secret, the one her mother had died holding, the one she'd carried 3.5 miles in the dark. I'm not going to write the exact words a 7-year-old used. Some things you keep, even from a page, but the shape of it was this: her daddy hurt her mama. Bad, and for a long time. And the night her mama died, it hadn't been the rain and it hadn't been the Henley grade. Posey had been awake. Posey had heard. And the last thing her mama had done, the very last thing, was get Posey into the closet, press the chew-eared rabbit into her arms, and whisper the directions to the ranch with the blue mailbox. "Find the big man, he's safe." I'd met Dana Whitfield maybe 40 times in my life. I'd carried her laundry baskets to her car twice when she had the flu. I'd overtipped her on the wash and fold because she always looked tired and I always recognized tired. That was the whole of our acquaintance. 40 hellos and 2 laundry baskets. And in the last terrified minutes of her life, mine was the name she'd reached for. The big man. The one the whole town was afraid of. The one everybody else had decided was dangerous. She'd looked at me her whole life and seen the opposite of what the town saw. She'd seen safe. I went out to the porch then. I told Posey I had to check on the horses, which was a lie, and I stood in the cold with my hands gripping the rail until I heard it crack, and I made a sound I had not made since I was a boy, and I let myself make it, because the girl couldn't hear me over Bruno's snoring, and I had earned the right to come apart for exactly 2 minutes before I had to be a fortress again. 2 minutes, that's all I gave myself. Then I went back inside, and I made a phone call. And that phone call was the beginning of the part where this whole town found out who I actually was. Part 2. Here is the thing nobody tells you about doing the right thing. The right thing makes enemies. I called the sheriff first because that is what you are supposed to do. Ward Pruitt had been the law in Caldwell County for 19 years. He knew everyone. He went hunting with everyone. And I'd learned this soon enough. He had gone hunting with Garrett Whitfield 3 times that fall alone. "Eli," he said when I got him on the phone. His voice did a funny thing when he heard mine, a kind of careful settling. "What can I do for you this early?" I told him I had Posey Whitfield at my place. I told him she'd walked here in the night. I told him what she'd told me about her mama, choosing my words plain and slow, the way you do when you need a thing to land right. There was a silence on the line, longer than it should have been. "Now, Eli," Ward said finally, and his voice had gone smooth and reasonable, the voice of a man talking a fellow down off a ledge. "I want you to be real careful here. You got a little girl who just lost her mama. Kids that age, they get scared, they make up stories, they get confused. You don't want to go saying things about a grieving father that you can't take back. You especially don't want to." He let that especially sit there. He didn't have to finish it. "You especially don't want to, Eli. A man like you, with your reputation, with your size. You go accusing a respectable fella of murder, and who do you think this town's gonna believe?" I'm not a fast man with words. I never have been. I stood there in my kitchen with the phone against my ear and the girl asleep in the chair behind me, Bruno curled at her feet. And I felt the old familiar thing rise up, the urge to apologize, to back down, to say, "You're right, Ward, I'm sorry to bother you. I'll just bring her by the station and let the experts handle it." The whole instinct of my whole life, which was to make myself small and disappear. I looked at Posey. She had her thumb near her mouth, not quite in it, the way kids do when they're old enough to be embarrassed about it even in their sleep. She'd kicked the blanket half off. The chewed-ear rabbit was tucked under her chin. And I thought about Dana Whitfield in the last minutes of her life, choosing my name. "He's safe." "Ward," I said, "I'm gonna tell you what's gonna happen. I'm gonna bring this girl to the hospital up in Mercer, not the clinic here, the hospital, where there's a doctor who doesn't go hunting with Garrett Whitfield. And I'm gonna have that doctor look at her and write down everything she sees official. And I'm gonna call the state child welfare office, not your office, the state." And I already wrote down everything Posey told me, word for word with the time and date, and I made a copy, and the copy isn't at my house. The last part was a bluff. I made the copy that afternoon, but I'd learned one thing from a lifetime of people underestimating me: sometimes you can use it. The smooth went out of Ward's voice. "You're making a mistake, Eli." "Maybe," I said. "I make a lot of them, but I'm not making this one." and I hung up before he could find the next reasonable thing to say because I was not sure I could hold the line through a second round. My hands were shaking. A man my size, hands like mine, shaking like the girls had at the gate. I want to be honest about that. Doing the right thing did not make me feel brave or strong. It made me feel like I was going to be sick. Courage, I have come to think, is not the absence of that feeling. It's doing the thing while the feeling is screaming at you to stop. The drive to Mercer was 40 minutes. Posey didn't say much. About halfway there she asked, in that small, careful voice, "Am I going to live with my daddy again?" I kept my eyes on the road. "Not if I have any say in it." "Do you have a say in it?" That was the question, wasn't it? A man like me, alone, no wife, a reputation in town as somebody to avoid, what say did I have in anything? The honest answer was probably not much. But I'd already learned that morning that the honest answer and the right answer aren't always the same, and a child who'd walked 3.5 miles in the dark deserved the right one. "I'm gonna fight for you to have a say," I said. "That's a promise, and I don't make promises I don't keep because I don't make hardly any at all. Ask anybody." She thought about that. Then she reached over and put her small cold hand on my forearm, just for a second, and took it back. I had to pull over for a minute after that. Told her I thought I saw a deer. The doctor in Mercer was a woman named Ann Sorensen, and she did not go hunting with anybody. She took Posey back, gentle and unhurried, and she came out 40 minutes later with a face I'd describe as professionally controlled and personally furious. She told me, in careful clinical language, that what she'd found was not consistent with a child who'd merely lost her mother in a car accident. She told me she was making it official. She told me she'd already called the state herself, and that the state was already interested in the Whitfield case for reasons that had nothing to do with me. That Dana Whitfield had been to 2 different ERs in 2 different counties in the last year, and that somebody upstream had been waiting for a reason to take a second look. Dana had been building a record, quiet, scattered, county to county so nobody would connect it, but building it. She'd been trying to get out. She'd been gathering proof, and she'd run out of time 11 days short of using it. But she'd done one more thing before she died. She'd pointed her daughter at the one door in the county she trusted to open. I sat in that waiting room with my hat in my enormous hands, and I thought about how a tired woman folding other people's laundry had been quietly, methodically, courageously trying to save her own life and her daughter's, and how nobody in town had seen it, because nobody in town really saw Dana Whitfield at all. They saw a quiet woman at a laundromat, the same way they saw a big scary man on a failing ranch. The town had a way of deciding what you were and then never looking again. Dana had looked again. At me. That was the whole reason any of this was happening. I decided, in that waiting room, that I was done being what the town had decided I was. Word got out fast, the way it does. By the time I drove back into Caldwell that evening, Posey staying the night at the Mercer Hospital under a social worker's eye, which gutted me to leave but which Ann swore was the right move. The whole town already knew that Big Eli Boyd had gone and dragged Garrett Whitfield's name through the mud over some story a traumatized kid had told. That was the version going around. Not a man protected a child. The version was that strange giant out on the North Road has finally cracked. I stopped at the diner because I needed coffee, and I needed, I think, to make myself stand in the middle of it instead of running home to my fortress. The bell over the door rang and the whole place went quiet in that particular way. Forks down. Conversations cut off mid-word. Garrett Whitfield was sitting in the corner booth. Of course he was. With 2 other men and Ward Pruitt's deputy, all of them with coffee, all of them looking at me. Garrett stood up. He was not a small man himself, though next to me most men aren't. He had that charmer's face on, the wounded and reasonable one. "Eli," he said, loud enough for the room, "I know you mean well. I know you found my girl, and Lord, I have been worried sick. I've had everybody out looking. But you've got to understand, she's confused, she's grieving, and these things you're saying, these terrible things about a man who just buried his wife." His voice cracked, perfectly, right on cue. "I just don't understand how you could do this to a family that's already broken." The room was watching me. I could feel it. The whole weight of every year I'd spent being the thing they were afraid of. And I absolutely knew what they expected. They expected me to mumble something and leave, to shrink, to prove I was exactly the slow, dangerous, best left alone creature they'd always believed in. I set my hat on the counter. "Garrett," I said, and I did not raise my voice. I have learned that a man my size never needs to raise his voice. The trick is the opposite. "You said you've had everybody out looking for her." "That's right, Then how come Ward there never called me? My place is the closest ranch to yours on that road. If a child's missing and you're searching, you call the neighbors. Nobody called me. Nobody called me because nobody was looking, Garrett. There wasn't any search. You knew exactly where she went. You just figured the big scary fella out on the north road would scare her right back home." I let that sit. "She wasn't scared of me, Garrett. You want to know what she was scared of?" He didn't answer. I picked my hat back up. "I think you do know," I said. "I think you know exactly." And I walked out, and the bell rang behind me. And the silence I left was a completely different kind of silence than the one I'd walked into. Part 3. It did not all turn out clean. I want to be honest about that, because the world is not a place where the right thing wins because it's the right thing. The right thing wins when it wins at all, because somebody is too stubborn to let it lose. The fight for Posey took 14 months. Garrett got a lawyer, a good one from the city, the kind a laundromat husband couldn't afford, which told its own story about who was helping him and why. There were hearings. There were depositions where men in suits asked me, in 17 different ways, whether a single unmarried man of my size and temperament and isolation, they loved that word, isolation, was a fit person to be involved in the life of a vulnerable little girl at all. They turned my whole careful fortress against me. "He keeps to himself. He has no family. He has a temper. I'd never raised a hand to a soul in my adult life, but you'd have thought, listening to them, that the only question was how long before I did." There were nights I came home from those hearings and sat in my truck in the dark and thought, "They're right. Who are you to do this? Go back to being left alone. It's easier. It's safer. It's what you're good at." And then I'd think about a yellow dress at my gate and a voice saying, "I'm sorry. I'll be good over a rattled fork." And I'd go inside and write another check to the lawyer I'd hired with money I got from selling 40 acres of the Boyd place. Land my family had held for 3 generations. I sold the land. I want that written down plain. I sold a third of everything my family ever built so a little girl who wasn't mine by blood would have someone willing to spend everything to keep her safe. People asked me if it was hard. It was the easiest decision I ever made. The land had never once looked at me and decided I was safe. The thing that finally turned it was Dana herself. Ann Sorensen, the doctor, was as stubborn as I was. She pulled those scattered ER records together, county by county, and a state investigator named Maria Reyes built them into something that couldn't be waved away. And then, this is the part that still takes the wind out of me, they found Dana's box. She'd kept a shoe box in the rafters of the laundromat storeroom, where Garrett never went because he thought folding clothes was beneath him. In it, dates, photographs she'd taken of her own injuries in the laundromat bathroom mirror, time-stamped. A spiral notebook in her tired, careful handwriting, documenting 4 years of a slow nightmare, and a letter sealed with 2 words on the front. For Posey. A woman who folded other people's laundry for a living had quietly assembled the most thorough case file the county investigator said she'd seen in 20 years of the job. Dana Whitfield wasn't a victim who'd been caught by surprise. She was a woman who had been planning her family's escape with the patience of someone who knew she might not survive the attempt, and who had made sure that if she didn't, the truth would survive in her place. She'd run out of road 11 days short. But she hadn't run out of plan. Garrett took a deal rather than let that box go in front of a jury. The specifics I'll keep, because they're Posey's to tell someday if she ever wants to. It's enough to say he is somewhere he cannot reach her, and that the town which had brought him casseroles spent a long, quiet season after that, not quite able to look each other in the eye. A whole town had decided what Dana Whitfield was, and what Garrett Whitfield was, and what I was, and we had all three of us turned out to be something else. That's a hard thing for a town to swallow. Caldwell County is still swallowing it. Posey came to live with me for good on a Tuesday in the spring. I'd spent 3 weeks getting the spare room right. Painted it yellow because of the dress, though I never told her that's why. Got a bed too small for me and exactly right for her. Bruno had taken to sleeping outside her door at the hospital visits, and the day she came home for good he installed himself there permanently and would not be moved, the coward finally finding something worth guarding. She's 9 now. She has a gap where the new tooth came in crooked and we're saving up for the orthodontist. She does her homework at my kitchen table while I do the books, and she has opinions about everything, loud ones, which I encourage, because I never want that child to whisper an apology over a rattled fork again as long as she lives. She is not a quiet, careful girl anymore. She is a holy terror and the great roaring joy of my entire life, and I would sell the rest of the land and my own 2 hands to keep her that way. People in town look at us different now. Some of them are warm. Some of them are uncomfortable. I've stopped trying to manage which. I spent 46 years making myself small so nobody would be afraid of me, and it turned out the thing that finally made them stop being afraid was watching me refuse to be small for once in my life. Posey asked me a while back why her mama picked me, out of everybody, a man she barely knew. I've thought about it more than almost anything. The truest answer I've got is this: I think tired people recognize each other. I think Dana folded my shirts and overthanked me for the laundry baskets and saw, underneath the size everybody else flinched at, a man who'd also spent his life bracing for a blow. I think she saw the flinch I'd buried so deep even I'd forgotten it was there. And I think she figured a man who knew that particular fear from the inside would never, ever be the one to put it in her daughter. She bet her child's life on a stranger's hidden grief. She bet right. The other night Posey was doing her reading on the porch, and Bruno had his head in her lap, and the light was going gold over the Henley Ridge the way it does in late spring, and she looked up at me out of nowhere and said, "I'm glad you're so big." I asked her why. She thought about it the way she thinks about everything, serious, gap-toothed, frowning a little. She said, "Here is the thing nobody tells you about doing the right thing. The right thing makes enemies, and it makes them fast, and the first one it makes is usually the part of yourself that just wants to be left alone." I want to start there with that part of me, because if I skip over it I'll come out of this story looking braver than I was. I wasn't brave that first morning. I was terrified in a way I hadn't been since I was a boy. Not of Garrett Whitfield and not of the sheriff, and not even of the lawyers I didn't yet know were coming. I was terrified of the phone on my kitchen wall, because picking it up meant becoming visible, and I had spent 27 years perfecting the art of being invisible in a body that no room could hide. Posey was asleep in the chair by the stove. I put a second blanket over her and she hadn't stirred. Bruno lay across her feet with his 3 good legs tucked under him and his cloudy old eyes half open, watching me the way he watched coyotes, except he wasn't watching her like she was the threat. He was watching her like she was something he'd been assigned to keep. The coward dog had found a job, and it had aged him into a guardian overnight. I looked at the 2 of them, then I picked up the phone. I called the sheriff first, because that is what you are supposed to do, and because I still believed that morning that the things you are supposed to do and the things that work were the same things. I would not believe that for very much longer. Ward Pruitt had been the law in Caldwell County for 19 years. I'd voted for him every time, not because I knew him well, but because nobody ran against him, and a man likes to feel he chose. He picked up on the fourth ring with sleep still in his voice, and when he heard it was me, that sleep did a strange thing. It didn't fade the way a man's voice clears when he wakes up. It settled. It went careful. Like a man who'd been half expecting a particular call, and was relieved it had finally come so he could get on with managing it. I told him I had Posey Whitfield at my place. I told him she'd walked the 3.5 miles from Route 9 in the dark, in one sock, no coat, before dawn. I told him what she'd told me about her mama, not the rain, not the Henley grade, but the truth she'd carried out of that house. I kept my words plain and slow, the way you lay fence posts, one solid thing after another so the whole line holds. There was a silence on the line. It went on a beat too long, and then another, and in that silence I heard something I should have heard years ago in this town and never had the ears for. "Now, Eli," Ward said. His voice had gone smooth as creek stone. "I want you to be real careful here, son. You've got a little girl who just lost her mama in a terrible accident. Children that age, they get scared, they get turned around, they make things up to make sense of a world that just stopped making sense. They'll say the wildest things. You don't want to go repeating a confused child's nightmares as if they were gospel. You don't want to do that to a grieving father. And you." He stopped just for a second, but I heard the shape of the unsaid thing, the way you hear a step missing in the dark. "You especially don't want to." He didn't finish it. He didn't have to. I'd been hearing that sentence finished by silence my whole life. A man like you, with your size, with your reputation, out there alone on that failing ranch, no wife, no church, no people. You go pointing at a respectable man and crying murder. Eli, who in God's name do you think this county is going to believe? I am not a fast man with words. I never have been, and I have made my peace with being the last one to speak in any room. But slow is not the same as stupid, and in that moment I understood three things all at once, the way you sometimes see a whole landscape in a single flash of lightning. The first, Ward Prout was not surprised. Not by the girl, not by the secret, not by any of it. A man is surprised when the world cracks open. Ward was managing. You only manage what you already knew was there. The second, he had decided which of two men in this story was worth protecting, and it was not the one with a dead wife and a missing daughter, and a shoebox full of reasons I didn't yet know existed. It was the one he went hunting with. The third, and this is the one that put steel in me, was that every instinct in my body was screaming at me to agree with him. To say, "You're right, Ward, I'm sorry to trouble you. I'll just run her down to the station and let you handle it, you know best." That instinct was so strong it frightened me more than Ward did. It was the instinct of my whole life. Make yourself small. Apologize for the space you take. Hand the hard thing to someone official and disappear back into the North Road where you belong. I looked at the girl in the chair. She had her thumb near her mouth but not in it, embarrassed about it even in sleep. The chew-eared rabbit was tucked under her chin. She had walked 3.5 miles in the dark on the strength of a dead woman's promise that the big man was safe. And I thought, if I hand her to Ward, I am handing her to the man who goes hunting with the thing she ran from. "Ward," I said, and I made my voice quiet because I have learned that a man my size never needs volume. The trick is the opposite, the quiet that makes a room lean in. "I'm gonna tell you what's gonna happen, and then you can do whatever you think is right on your end. Eli, I'm gonna drive her up to the hospital in Mercer, not the clinic here, the hospital, where there's a doctor who doesn't sit in a deer blind with Garrett Whitfield 3 weekends a fall." I heard him take a breath at that, and I kept going before he could spend it. "I'm gonna have that doctor look at her and write down what she finds, official, with her name on it. And I'm gonna call the state child welfare office myself. Not your office. The state." And I already sat down and wrote out everything Posey told me, every word with the date and the time of morning, and I made a copy, and the copy is not in my house. So if anything happens to me or to her or to a piece of paper, that copy still says what it says. The copy was a bluff. I wouldn't make it until that afternoon at the library on the machine that takes dimes. But I had spent 46 years being underestimated, and I had learned that a man's low opinion of you is a tool you can hand right back to him sharpened. The smooth went out of Ward's voice all at once, like water off a hot stone. You're making a mistake, Eli. A big one. For a man who can't afford lawyers and doesn't have a soul in this town to vouch for him, you are making the worst mistake of your life. Maybe, I said. I've made a lot of them, built my whole life out of them if I'm honest, but I'm not making this one. And I set the phone back on its hook before he could find the next reasonable, settling, lethal thing to say, because I was not certain I could hold the line through a second round, and I had learned that morning to stop a fight while I was still standing. My hands were shaking. A man my size, hands like cured hams, shaking like the girls had on the gate rail. I want that written down because the movies lie about courage. Courage did not feel like a swelling of music in my chest. It felt like nausea. It felt like the floor tilting. It felt exactly like the thing it always feels like, the thing screaming, stop, this costs too much, go back to safe, and doing it anyway with shaking hands while you want to be sick. Anyone who tells you brave feels good has never had to be it. The drive to Mercer was 40 minutes of two-lane blacktop through country I'd known my whole life and never once felt so far from home in. The heater took a while. Posey sat small against the door with the rabbit and watched the fence posts go by, counting them under her breath the way some kids do. And I let her, because counting is a thing a person can hold on to when nothing else will stay still. About halfway, somewhere on the long straight past the Caldwell Water Tower, she stopped counting and said, in that careful, practiced voice that broke my heart every time I heard it, "Am I going to have to live with my daddy again?" I kept my eyes on the road. A semi went by the other way and rocked the truck, and I waited for it to pass before I trusted my voice. "Not if I have any say in it," I said. She turned to look at me. I could feel it more than see it. "Do you have a say in it?" And there it was. The whole question, asked plain by a 7-year-old, the question all the lawyers would spend 14 months asking me in their fancier way. A single unmarried man of 46, no wife, no family, a reputation as the fellow you don't approach, a third mortgaged ranch on the dry end of the county. What say did I have? In the eyes of the world, in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of every casserole-bearing soul in Caldwell, the honest answer was almost none. But the honest answer and the right answer are not always the same thing, and I'd already learned that much before the sun was fully up. A child who'd walked 3.5 miles in the dark on a dead woman's promise was owed the right one. "I'm gonna get a say in it," I told her. "I'm gonna fight for you to have one. That's a promise, Posey. And here's the thing about me, I don't make promises hardly ever because I hate to break 'em more than I hate just about anything. So when I do make one, it's load-bearing. You understand load-bearing? It's the post that holds the whole fence up. That's what this promise is." She was quiet a moment. Then she reached across the bench seat and put her small cold hand flat on my forearm, just for a breath, the way you'd touch something to make sure it was real, and then she took it back and went on watching the fence posts. I had to pull onto the shoulder for a minute after that. I told her I thought I'd seen a deer in the brush and didn't want to risk it. There was no deer. There has never in the history of the world been a deer at the moments I have claimed to see one. But she nodded very seriously and helped me watch for it, and that gave me the minute I needed to get my face back under me. The doctor in Mercer was named Ann Sorensen, and the first thing I will say about her is that she did not go hunting with anybody, and the second thing is that she looked at me, all 6'7" of me filling up her little waiting room, and did not flinch, did not measure, did not do any of the small flickering calculations I'd watched 1,000 strangers do at the sight of me. She looked at me like a person. Then she looked at Posey like a person too, knelt down to the girl's height, and asked her in a low, even voice whether it would be all right if the two of them went and had a talk, just them, and Posey could stop any time she wanted to. Posey looked back at me. The whole question of her trust in that one look. "I'll be right here," I said, and pointed at a plastic chair that was never going to hold me but that I was going to occupy if it killed the both of us. Right in that exact chair, not moving, big as a barn. "You'll be able to see me through the glass if you want to check." She checked 3 times through that little wire-laced window while she was back there. 3 times I gave her a small nod and held up my open hand so she could see them, empty and still, and 3 times she turned back to Dr. Sorensen satisfied. They were back there 40 minutes. I sat in a chair built for ordinary men with my hat upside down in my lap, and my huge hands wrapped around the brim, and I prayed, which I had not done in years, in no particular words, just a kind of pressure aimed at whatever might be listening. When Anne came out, she had a face I'd come to know well over the next year, a face holding 2 things at once and not letting either one win. Professionally controlled, personally, underneath, white hot. She sat down beside me. She did not sit far away the way people do. She told me, in careful clinical language, that she was choosing the way I'd chosen my fence-post words on the phone, that what she had found on that child was not consistent with grief, and was not consistent with an accident, and was consistent with a great many other things she would be putting in writing, in detail, with her signature today. She told me Posey had said the same things to her that the girl had said to me, unprompted, with details a child does not invent. And then she told me the thing that turned the whole morning sideways. She told me she'd already called the state, herself, before she even came out to tell me, and that the state had been interested, that the file had a flag on it that predated this morning by months. That Dana Whitfield had walked into 2 different emergency rooms in 2 different counties over the past year, given 2 different stories, and that a sharp-eyed nurse somewhere upstream had done the math and started a quiet folder, and that the folder had been sitting in a drawer waiting for one more thing to make it move. This morning was the one more thing. I sat there and I understood in a slow, cold wave that Dana had been building something, county to county, story to story, ER to ER, not random, not careless, methodical. A woman laying her own fence in the dark so that nobody could see the line until it was finished. She had been gathering proof of her own life the way you'd gather evidence of a crime, because that is exactly what it was, and she had been doing it alone, tired, folding strangers' laundry by day, and documenting her own slow nightmare by some other light. She'd run out of time, 11 days short of finishing. But she hadn't run out of plan, because the last move in the plan, the very last one, had been a name whispered into a closet. Find the big man with the blue mailbox. He's safe. She'd kept one card she couldn't put in any folder, and the card was me. I had carried that woman's laundry baskets to her car exactly twice. I had overtipped her on the wash-in fold, because she always looked the particular kind of tired I recognized. 40 hellos and 2 laundry baskets across a whole lifetime, and in the last terrified minutes of hers, she'd reached past every neighbor and deacon and the sheriff himself and reached for me. I sat in that too small chair, and I made a decision that I have never once regretted and never once found easy. I decided I was done being what the town had decided I was, whatever it cost, however sick it made me feel. The big man was going to be exactly as big as this required. They kept Posey and Mercer that first night. A social worker named Ruth, gray-haired, soft-spoken, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, sat with us and explained, gentle but immovable, that the rules were the rules, that a child this fresh out of harm went into a neutral, safe place under trained eyes while the grown-ups sorted the law of it, and that no, I could not take her home, not yet, not even though I was the door her mother had pointed her toward. I am not ashamed to say I argued. I am not ashamed to say I lost. What I am a little ashamed of is the 2 long seconds where I considered, with my whole enormous body, simply picking the child up and walking out and daring anyone in that building to stop me, because I could have, and we all 3 knew I could have, and that knowledge sat in the room like a held breath. It was Posey who settled it. She tugged my sleeve and said, "It's okay. There's a window in the room, Ruth says. I can see the parking lot." She looked up at me with that gap-toothed seriousness. "You could park there, where I can see the truck." So I did. I drove home for nothing but to feed the stock and let Bruno out, and then I drove the 40 minutes back, and I parked my truck under the one light pole in that hospital lot that faced the children's wing, and I sat in it the whole night with the engine off and a horse blanket over my knees, and somewhere up above me, behind a wire-laced window, a 7-year-old went to sleep checking, the way she'd checked through the glass that afternoon, that the big man was still right where he said he'd be. He didn't move till morning. Word got out fast, the way it always does in a town of 2,000. By the time I drove back into Caldwell the next evening, Posey still up in Mercer, which gutted me, but which Ruth and Ann both swore was the right hard thing. The whole county already had a story, and it was not the true one. The true one was, a man protected a child. The story going around was, that strange giant out on the North Road has finally cracked, started raving about murder, dragging a grieving father's name through the dirt over some kid's bad dream. I heard it before I'd even parked, 2 men talking outside the feed store going quiet when my truck rolled by. I'd been the subject of low talk my whole life. I knew the exact pitch of it. This was that pitch turned up. I should have gone home. Every cell I had wanted to go home, to the fortress, to the North Road, to being left alone. Instead, I stopped at the diner. I needed coffee, I told myself. The truth is I needed to stand in the middle of the thing instead of running from it. 46 years of running from rooms had to end somewhere, and I picked that one. The bell over the door rang. The room did the thing rooms do when I enter, the small hush, forks set down. Conversations cut clean off mid-word, except tonight there was an extra freight in it, because tonight they all had the story. And in the corner booth, of course, sat Garrett Whitfield, coffee in front of him, 2 other men beside him, and Ward Prout's deputy in uniform third from the wall. Garrett saw me and stood up, slow, sorrowful. He was not a small man himself, though beside me few are, and he'd dressed his face in the one I'd learned he kept for audiences, the wounded, reasonable, more in grief than anger one. "Eli," he said, pitched for the whole room. "I know you mean well, I do. You found my little girl and brought her somewhere safe, and I'll be grateful to my dying day for that, I will." His voice did a small, expert crack. "But these things you've been saying, about me, about her mother, God rest her, about a family that's already been broken clean in half by a tragedy. I cannot understand how a man could look at all that hurt and decide to pour poison on it. I don't know what I ever did to you." The whole room watched me. I could feel every year of every flinch in it, and I knew precisely what they expected, what they'd always expected of the big slow fellow from the North Road. They expected me to mumble, to redden, to shrink down into myself and back out the door and prove, once and finally, that I was exactly the thing they'd decided I was. I took my hat off and set it on the counter, crown down, slow. "Garrett," I said, quiet, so the room had to lean. "You just told everybody here you've had folks out looking for your girl, that you've been worried sick, that you had a search going." "That's right, I've barely slept, I." "Then how come nobody called me?" He stopped. "My place is the closest ranch to yours on Route 9, closest house of any kind near enough. A child goes missing in the night and her daddy's got a search on. The first thing you do, the first thing any man here'll tell you, is you call your neighbors. You call the closest doors. Nobody called my door, Garrett, not you, not Ward, not your deputy friend there. I let it sit in the quiet. Nobody called me because there wasn't any search. You knew where she'd gone. You figured the big scary fella on the North Road would put enough fear in her to send her running right back home before breakfast." I looked at him a long moment. "She wasn't scared of me, Garrett. Not for 1 second. You want to know what she was scared of?" He didn't answer. The expert grief had gone out of his face and left something flatter and colder behind it, just for an instant before he could fix it, and a few people in that diner saw it. I watched them see it. You can't unsee a thing like that. I picked my hat back up. I think you know exactly what she was scared of, I said. I think it's the one thing in this whole world you know better than anybody. And I walked out. The bell rang behind me, and the silence I left in that room was not the silence I'd walked into. The one I'd walked into was the town's old silence. Here's the thing we're afraid of. The one I left was new. It was the silence of a room full of people who just had a story they'd swallowed whole come halfway back up and didn't know yet whether they were going to be able to keep choking it down. I drove the 40 minutes back to Mercer and parked under the light pole again. The fight was just barely starting. I didn't yet know about the city lawyer, or the 14 months, or the 40 acres I'd sell, or the shoebox in the laundromat rafters with 2 words written on a sealed envelope inside it. All of that was still ahead, out past the headlights. But I knew one thing I hadn't known the morning before. Sitting in that lot with the engine ticking cool, and a child asleep behind a wire-laced window above me. I knew I wasn't going to be small again. Not ever, not for anybody. It did not all turn out clean. I need to say that before I say anything else, because if I let this story end the way stories are supposed to end, I'd be lying to you. And I made a promise once to a little girl about not breaking promises, and I find it's bled into how I tell things now. The world is not a place where the right thing wins on account of being right. I used to half believe it was. I think most people half believe it, the same way they half believe they'll get around to fixing the gate before it falls. The right thing wins when it wins at all because somebody decides to be too stubborn to let it lose and pays for that stubbornness out of their own pocket in coin they can't ever get back. That's the whole secret. There's no music in it. There's just a man writing checks he can't afford and not stopping. The fight for Posey took 14 months. I'll walk you through it, because the 14 months are the part of the story nobody in town ever saw, and they're the part that mattered most. Garrett got a lawyer within the week. Not a county lawyer. Not the fellow over the hardware store who does wills and fender benders. A man from the city, 3 hours off, in a suit that cost more than my best bull, with a soft handshake and a way of saying your name that made it sound like a thing he'd already filed away to use against you. The first time I saw him, I did the arithmetic the way a rancher does. What a man like that charges by the hour against what a laundromat husband could possibly have in the bank. And the answer told me a story all by itself. Somebody was paying for Garrett Whitfield. Somebody with reasons. I never did learn for certain who, though I have my guesses, and a couple of them go hunting in the fall. I got a lawyer too. Her name was Joan Bex, and she practiced out of a converted house in Mercer with a porch that sagged and a coffee maker older than Posey. And she took one look at the situation and one look at me and said, "They're going to make this about you instead of about him. You understand that? They can't win on the facts of what he did, so they'll try to win on the facts of what you are." She let that sit. "How thick is your skin, Mr. Boyd?" "Thin," I said. "Always has been. I just built a lot of wall around it." She nodded like that was the right answer. "Good. Thin skin and a high wall. The wall's about to get tested. Don't let them knock it down in front of the judge, and don't you dare let them find out how thin the skin is underneath." She was right about all of it. The depositions were the worst of it, worse than the hearings, because in the depositions there's no judge to rein anybody in, just a court reporter and a long table, and the city lawyer with all the time in the world to take a man apart one careful question at a time. They had clearly studied me. They knew about my father, about the family plot, about the drinking, about what kind of house I'd grown up in, dredged up from somewhere, because in a small county there's always somebody who remembers. And they turned every single thing I'd ever done to keep myself safe into evidence that I was dangerous. "Mr. Boyd, isn't it true you don't attend any church?" "Yes." "You don't belong to any clubs, boards, civic organizations?" "No." "You live alone?" "Yes." "No wife? No children of your own? No close friends the town could name?" Each yes landed like a brick, and I watched the city lawyer stack them, one on the next, building a wall of his own, a wall that spelled out isolation, their favorite word, said so often across those 14 months that I came to hate the sound of the letters. A man who keeps to himself. A man with a temper in his blood. A man of unusual size and unusual habits, alone on a remote property, who now wishes to take a vulnerable little girl out where no one can see. I had never raised a hand to a soul in my adult life. Not once. But you would not have known it from that table. They made my whole careful, quiet, fortress of a life into the profile of a thing to be feared. And the terrible part, the part I have to be honest about, is that some nights I drove home from Mercer and sat in the truck in my own dark yard and thought they might be right. "Who are you to do this?" the voice said. The old voice. "Look at you. No people. No proof you can love anything but cattle and a three-legged dog. Go back to being left alone. It's safer. It's easier. It's the one thing in the world you're actually good at. Hand the girl to people who know how. Disappear back up the North Road where you belong." And then I'd think about a yellow dress on my gate before dawn. I'd think about "I'm sorry, I'll be good" over a rattled fork. I'd think about a small cold hand on my forearm and a voice asking, "Do you have a say in it?" And I'd go inside and sit down at the kitchen table and write Joan Beck's another check. I sold 40 acres of the Boyd place to keep writing those checks. I want it written plain, because people in town asked me later, careful and amazed, whether it had been a hard thing to do, to sell off a third of land my family had held 3 generations, land my grandfather had broken and my father had drunk himself half to death over and never quite let go of. Was it hard, Eli? Like I'd torn off my own arm. It was the easiest decision I ever made in my life. The land had never once looked at me and decided I was safe. The land had never reached over a truck seat to touch my arm. The land was dirt and debt, and the long shadow of a man I'd spent my whole life trying not to become, and I let 40 acres of it go to a neighbor for cash and signed the papers without my hand shaking even a little, and I drove the money to Mercer feeling lighter than I'd felt since I was a boy. People think love is a feeling. I've come to think love is mostly a column of subtractions you're glad to make. What I had left after the land sale was a smaller ranch, a thinner herd, a lawyer with a sagging porch, and a stubbornness that would not quit. It turned out to be enough, just barely. But the thing that turned it in the end wasn't my money or Joan's lawyering, or even Ann Sorensen's signature on her careful clinical pages. The thing that turned it was Dana. I told you Dana Whitfield had been building something. I didn't yet know, those first weeks, how much. Ann pulled the emergency room records together, county by county, story by story, and Joan turned them into a timeline that couldn't be waved away as a confused child's nightmare. The state investigator, a woman named Maria Reyes who'd been doing the job 20 years and had a way of going very still and very quiet when she found a thing that mattered, took that timeline and went looking for more. She found the box. Dana had kept a box, a plain shoe box, hidden up in the rafters of the laundromat storeroom on Catron Street, in the one corner of her own working life her husband never went near, because Garrett Whitfield thought folding strangers' clothes was beneath a man and never once set foot back there. Maria found it standing on an overturned bucket with a flashlight in her teeth, and she told me later her hands shook when she got it down, and Maria Reyes is not a woman whose hands shake. Inside, dates. Pages of them in a tired, careful hand I recognized the moment I saw it, the same hand that had written my receipts at the wash and fold. Photographs, and I won't describe them. They're not mine to describe. But I'll tell you she had taken them herself in the laundromat bathroom mirror, time-stamped, methodical, a woman documenting her own life like evidence at a scene, because that is precisely what it was. A spiral notebook, the kind they sell 3 for $1 at the drugstore, filled front to back across 4 years with the slow, itemized record of a nightmare she had decided, at some point, to survive on paper even if she couldn't survive it in the flesh. And a letter, sealed, with 2 words written on the front in that same tired hand. For Posey. I have thought about that woman every day since. A person who folded other people's laundry for a living, who looked tired around the eyes, who I dismissed across a lifetime as a quiet, sad fixture of the town. And underneath that, in secret, in the dark, with no help and no hope of being believed, she had assembled the most complete and devastating record of a crime that Maria Reyes said she'd seen in 2 decades of the work. Dana Whitfield was not a victim taken by surprise. She was a woman who had looked clear-eyed at what was coming for her and decided that if it caught her, it would not get to keep its secret. She built her own justice in the rafters of a laundromat, one drugstore notebook page at a time, so that if she ran out of road, the truth would keep going without her. She ran out of road, 11 days short of using any of it. But she had not run out of plan, because the last page of the plan wasn't in the box at all. The last page was a name whispered into a closet, pressed into a child's arms along with a 1-eared rabbit. The one card she couldn't file, couldn't photograph, couldn't write down, the living card. A door 3.5 miles up Route 9 with a blue mailbox, and a big man behind it she had decided, on the strength of 40 hellos and 2 laundry baskets, was safe. She bet her child's whole life on a stranger's hidden grief. She bet right. Garrett took a deal rather than let that box go in front of a jury. The specifics of the deal and the specifics of what the box held I'm going to keep, because they belong to Posey, and someday, if she ever wants to, they're hers to tell or hers to bury, and not mine to spend in a story. It's enough to say that he is somewhere he cannot reach her, for a long time, and that the city lawyer collected his fee and drove his expensive suit back to the city and was never seen in Caldwell County again. The town did not handle it well. I don't say that with any meanness. I say it because it's true and because it's the part people most want left out. A whole town had brought that man casseroles. A whole town had crossed the street from me and brought him casseroles. They decided what Dana Whitfield was, a quiet, sad woman, and what Garrett Whitfield was, a charming fella down on his luck, and what I was, the thing on the North Road to be avoided. And every one of those 3 verdicts turned out wrong, and a town cannot find that out about itself and stay comfortable in its own skin. So there was a long, quiet season in Caldwell after that, where people couldn't quite meet each other's eyes at the feed store, where the diner went hushed for different reasons than it used to go hushed for me. They'd all driven past Dana's laundromat 10,000 times. They'd all said hey to Garrett at the pumps. The not seeing had been a group effort, and the seeing, when it finally came, was a group shame, and they're still working through it. A town is a slow animal. It is still swallowing this. I expect it'll be swallowing it long after I'm gone. Posey came to live with me for good on a Tuesday in the spring. I'd had 3 weeks' notice, and I spent every spare hour of them on the spare room. It had been a dead room my whole tenure on that ranch, full of broken tack and a sewing machine that hadn't run since my mother, and I hauled all of it out and I painted the walls yellow. Pale yellow, like butter, like the dress. I never told Posey that's why. Some things a man keeps even from the person they're for. I built a bed too small for me, and exactly the right size for a girl who'd been folding herself small her whole life, and I put a lamp by it shaped like a half-moon because the social worker Ruth mentioned, once, in passing, that the child didn't care for the full dark, and I'd filed that away the way you file away load-bearing things. Bruno settled the question of where he'd be sleeping without consulting anybody. The first night she was home for good, the coward dog dragged his blanket from in front of the stove, his post of 4 years, and reinstalled it across the threshold of her door, 3 good legs folded under him, cloudy eyes toward the hall, and there he has slept every night since. He'd found something worth guarding the morning she came to the gate, and he was not about to be relieved of duty now. She's 9 now. She has a gap where the new front tooth grew in crooked, and we are saving up for the orthodontist in Mercer, and she is mortified about the gap in the way 9-year-olds are mortified, loudly and often, which I take as the best news I've had in years, because a child who feels safe enough to be vain about her teeth is a child who has stopped bracing for the blow. She does her homework at the kitchen table in the evenings while I do the ranch books across from her, and she has opinions about everything. About the books, about the cattle, about how I make coffee, about the precise injustice of bedtime, loud opinions, sharp ones, and I encourage every last one of them, because I will go to my own family plot before I ever again hear that child whisper I'm sorry. I'll be good over a rattled fork. She is not a quiet, careful girl anymore. She is a holy terror. She argues, she sulks, she leaves her bicycle exactly where I'll trip on it. She has named 4 of the cattle and refuses to let me sell them. She sings off-key and on purpose to torture me, and she is the single great roaring joy of my entire life. And I would sell the rest of the land and these 2 big useless hands besides to keep her exactly, defiantly, gloriously the way she is. The town looks at the 2 of us different now. Some warm, some still uncomfortable. There are folks who can't fully forgive me for being right when they were wrong, and I've made my peace with them too. I stopped, a while back, trying to manage which kind of look I get. I spent 46 years making myself small so that nobody in this county would ever be afraid of me. And the joke of it, the great cosmic joke, is that the thing which finally cured them of their fear was watching me refuse, for the first time in my life, in front of all of them, in a diner and a courtroom and a deposition table, to be small even once. Posey asked me a while back why her mama picked me, out of the whole town, a man she barely knew. I've turned that question over more than almost anything I own. The truest answer I've found is this, and I gave it to her plain, the way I give her everything now. I think tired people recognize each other. I think Dana Whitfield folded my shirts and overthanked me for carrying 2 laundry baskets and saw, underneath all the sighs the rest of the town flinched from, a man who'd also spent his whole life bracing for a blow that came in childhood and never fully stopped coming. I think she saw a flinch in me I'd buried so deep that even I had forgotten it was down there. And I think she made the cold, clear calculation of a woman with nothing left but calculation. That a man who knew that particular fear from the inside, who'd worn it as a boy, would die before he'd ever be the one to put it into her daughter. She read me right. She read me righter than I'd read myself in 46 years. The sealed letter, the one that said for Posey, Posey has it. Unopened. Ruth and Joan and I all agreed it should be the girl's to open when the girl is ready, on no schedule but her own, and it lives in a small cedar box on the shelf above the half-moon lamp, next to the one-eared rabbit and a photograph of a tired woman with kind eyes. Some nights I see Posey take the box down and just hold it, not opening it, the way you hold a thing whose weight is the whole point. I don't say anything. I let her hold it. She'll open it when she opens it. Load-bearing things keep. The other evening she was out on the porch with her reading, and Bruno had his gray head heavy in her lap, and the light was going gold over the Henley Ridge the way it does in late spring, slow and reluctant, like the day itself didn't want to leave. And out of nowhere, the way everything important with her comes out of nowhere, she looked up at me and said, "I'm glad you're so big." I asked her why. She thought about it. She thinks about everything, my girl, serious and frowning, working the gap with the tip of her tongue the way she does. She said, "The rest of it I'm keeping. Some things don't go on a page, and that's one. I'll tell you only that I stood up and said I'd best go check on the horses, and that there were no horses needing checked. There are never any horses, and that Bruno gave the girl 1 more minute of his head in her lap before he heaved himself up on his 3 good legs and followed me out into the yard. And I'll tell you that for the second time in 2 years I gave myself exactly 2 minutes out there in the gold light to come all the way apart, and that this time the coming apart wasn't grief or fear or any of the old things. It was the other thing, the one I never had a word for and don't much need one for now." Then I wiped my face on my sleeve, and I went back up onto the porch, and I sat down beside her where she could lean on me, and I stayed there being the only thing a tired woman ever asked me to be, for as long as that child needs me.